Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime. The air in the dome is always cold this late, even in high summer, and the only light comes from the faint, sickly glow of the monitors reflecting off the aluminum casing of the telescope, the kind of light that makes you feel both intensely awake and deeply, irretrievably alone. We're deep into an observation run, focused on the lunar cycle, specifically tracking micrometeorite impacts in the northern hemisphere. But tonight, the moon gave me something back. Something cold, mathematically precise, and utterly terrifying. Tonight, we're going somewhere the light refuses to follow. And honestly, you probably won't make it to the end of this one without feeling that familiar prickle of cosmic insignificance crawl up your spine. It's okay. That's why we're here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're watching live or catching this later, drop a comment with your location and local time. It helps me feel a little less isolated staring into the void, knowing there are others out there sharing the creeping stillness of the late hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. I had the primary scope locked onto the terminator, that razor-sharp line between lunar day and night. It was just past third quarter, the perfect angle for studying the long, stretching shadows cast by the mountains and crater rims. This is where you see the true geometry of the moon, stark relief carving out faces and features that hide completely under high sun. I was using a specialized filter, pushing the sensor sensitivity to capture the faint scattering of light in the penumbra, the slightly fuzzy, transition zone of shadow. By definition, light does not stop instantly. It fades, diffracts, and scatters according to the rules of physics established across 300 years of observation. That scatter is what gives the shadows texture, what gives them their physical reality. It's what keeps the universe predictable. But on this particular night, 2:30 a.m., the temperature dropping outside, the screens glowing a steady, hypnotic cyan, the predictable universe hit a wall. I was zoomed in tight, looking for evidence of a recent seismic slip near the crater Aristarchus. The image was pristine, the air was steady, and the system was compensating flawlessly for atmospheric distortion. I noticed the anomaly not in the lit area, but in the shadow itself. Specifically, the edge of the shadow. The penumbra, the soft, gradual transition zone where light only partially hits, simply wasn't behaving. Instead of the gentle gradient, instead of the expected airy disk limitations causing the usual subtle blooming and fading, the shadow possessed an edge of absolute, violent termination. It was mathematically sharp, but beyond that sharpness, the texture of the darkness inside the umbra was wrong. It wasn't merely absence of light, it was active nullification. I adjusted the exposure, compensating for potential sensor clipping, but the data persisted. The line marking the beginning of the pure shadow wasn't a diffusion curve. It was a Euclidean boundary, straight and unforgiving, as if the light itself had been sliced off by an infinitely thin blade. I've spent thousands of hours staring at shadows cast by the moon, by planets, by artificial light sources. I know how light behaves in a vacuum, how it refracts through the Earth's atmosphere, and how it bends around obstacles. Every shadow we observe is a reflection of the source, the blocker, and the medium. This shadow was defying the medium. My first thought, the immediate, pragmatic thought, was that the scope's internal baffling had slipped, or perhaps an ice crystal had formed on the primary mirror, a common, frustrating occurrence when operating at cryogenic temperatures. I ran a diagnostic, cycling the optics. Nothing. The system reported optimal alignment and temperature. I switched to the secondary sensor array, which uses a completely different set of filters and optical trains. The anomaly held, appearing exactly at the same lunar coordinates, manifesting as that impossible boundary of nullification. The coldness in the dome suddenly felt different. It wasn't just the ambient temperature, it felt like a sink, drawing heat and light away from me. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the glass momentarily before dissipating. I was looking at the familiar craters, Schrödinger, Babha, but the shadows they cast were too dense. They didn't feel like voids, they felt like presence. I cross-referenced the coordinates with the known solar zenith angle. The physics stated that at this angle, given the scattering properties of the moon's regolith and the slight glow of earthshine, the shadow should have a perceptible, measurable degree of scattering. We should be able to detect photons entering the penumbra from the sides. But the count was zero. Absolute zero. It wasn't the darkness of night. It was the darkness of something consuming light, not just blocking it. I started running sophisticated image processing algorithms, edge detection, spectral analysis. The program kept throwing error codes, not because the image was corrupted, but because the mathematical model of the boundary curve couldn't be parsed. It was mathematically non-Euclidean, twisting and turning in ways that defied the simple projection of a sphere receiving parallel light rays. It was as if the boundary of the shadow was actively generating its own complex geometry. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how truly thin the skin of reality is. We live happily assuming that our geometry holds, that light follows simple rules, that the shadows we cast are merely the inverse image of ourselves. But staring at that impossible line, that sharp, hungry termination, a slow, deep dread began to form. It wasn't about equipment failure anymore. It was about the fundamental stability of the visible cosmos. I remembered old mythic concepts, the chthonic mirrors spoken of in forgotten texts, the idea that every physical object casts not just a shadow, but a dark reflection in a lower dimension, a twin entity waiting to be revealed when the conditions are perfect. The moon, a cold, indifferent sphere, seemed like the perfect host for such a revelation. Its shadow, the immense, sweeping veil it casts through space, was supposed to be empty. But this felt weighted. This felt like a substance. I spent the next 3 hours, until the gray pre-dawn light began to smudge the east, trying to find a terrestrial explanation. Wind vibration? No. Thermal expansion? No. Sensor drift? No. Everything pointed back to the object itself. The moon's shadow was behaving like a physical body with a density that could aggressively absorb light, yet it was moving with the exact orbital mechanics of our moon. But the sheer visual contradiction, the absolute zero light count at an edge that should be fuzzy, suggested something was riding the umbra. Something that wasn't lunar, something that wasn't rock or dust, but something that had been quietly, perfectly positioning itself in the absence of light, using our own celestial mechanics as its cloak. And it was distorting space just enough to make the shadow's edges impossibly sharp. I recorded the full data set, my hands shaking slightly now, a chill that originated far deeper than the air temperature gripping me. The feeling wasn't just fear, it was profound, unsettling awe at the quiet audacity of the impossible. The simple fact was, the shadow cast by the moon was no longer mathematically ours. The next step, logically, was triangulation and analysis of the distortion field. If the shadow was unnaturally sharp, it implied an interaction with light, a colossal, silent gravitational or refractive effect occurring before the photons reached the lunar surface. I adjusted the primary mirror to monitor the coronal field of the moon itself. When we look at the moon, we see reflected light. But just around the edges, we look through the faint, tenuous gases and dust particles surrounding it, the exosphere. I began looking for subtle shifts in the background stellar catalog as they passed behind this boundary. I spent the entirety of the next day running on coffee and adrenaline, cross-referencing my anomalous readings with archived images from NASA and ESA, specifically looking for historical solar eclipse data, those rare moments when the umbra falls directly upon the Earth. That's the most famous shadow the moon casts. If this distortion was new, I wanted to know when it started. If it was ancient, I wanted to know why nobody had captured it before. I found dozens of records detailing temperature drops, atmospheric turbulence, and the stunning visual appearance of the corona, but nothing, absolutely nothing, mentioning a boundary of mathematical nullification. This was a recent development, or it was subtle enough that only a deep space observatory with specialized filters could catch it. And I had caught it. That night, the moon was higher, and the viewing conditions were even better. I wasn't looking for meteorite impacts now. I was performing a controlled experiment. I fired a tightly collimated laser beam, calibrated to a specific frequency, directly at the edge of the terminator where I had observed the anomaly. This technique is often used in atmospheric physics. You track the laser scatter to map density and composition. If the shadow was normal, the laser light would scatter predictably as it hit the edges and the regolith. But the moment the beam crossed the threshold into the geometric boundary, it simply ceased to exist. Not diffused, not reflected, but instantly and completely absorbed. It was like pouring water into a bottomless pit that only manifested when the water touched the rim. I tried 5 different frequencies, from infrared up to near UV. Each beam vanished with the same abrupt, definitive termination. This was no mere shadow. Shadows diffuse, shadows scatter, shadows fade. This was an active void defined by an invisible field. The implications were staggering, anchored by the cold certainty of the data. The distortion proved that the mass of the moon wasn't the only thing casting the shadow. There was something else, an entity or a structure, operating in the deep, unlit regions. It wasn't occupying the volume of the moon, but seemed to be using the moon's established gravitational well and orbital path as a template for something much larger and geometrically precise. The moon was merely the visible anchor point for an immense, invisible refractive layer. I began mapping the boundary using proprietary phase shift sensors. I had to know the physical dimensions of the hidden structure. If it was gravitational, it should affect the local space-time, bending the light of background galaxies. It did, but the bending wasn't spherical, which is what the moon's mass dictates. The warping was faceted. It was structured like an immense, imperfect prism. The light of distant quasars, observable just past the limb of the moon, was being subtly stretched and compressed. When I inverted the stretching data, I didn't see the curve of a satellite or the bulk of a planet. I saw planes, flat, infinite planes intersecting at impossible angles. The distortion field suggested a structure roughly 3 times the diameter of the moon, perfectly centered on the moon's center of gravity, completely invisible to the naked eye, and existing almost entirely in the shadow volume. This wasn't just a strange effect. This was a colossal, hidden entity positioned perfectly between the Earth and the sun's illumination. It was shielding itself with our own satellite. I tried to rationalize it with known concepts, perhaps a dark matter aggregation, perhaps a strange exotic phenomenon predicted by superstring theory. But the structure was too regular, too intentional. Dark matter doesn't usually manifest as immense, multifaceted geometric planes with razor-sharp edges. The fear transitioned into genuine, existential terror, mixed with a chilling sense of privilege. I was the only person on Earth currently seeing the mathematical proof of this impossible refraction field. I felt like I was staring into the architectural blueprints of an ancient god, seeing the scaffolding holding up the illusion of our three-dimensional reality. The precision required for this entity to orbit the Earth, synchronized perfectly with the moon's period, always positioned in the shadow, was beyond accidental. It implied purpose. We sometimes talk about the ancient gods, the entities of H.P. Lovecraft, the things that dwell outside the sphere of human comprehension. We dismiss them as mythic or speculative concepts. But what if those myths were just imperfect, terrified attempts by early observers to map impossible geometry? What if the structure I was seeing, the Shadow Rider, was one of those ancient things, finally achieving a configuration that allowed it to passively assert its presence? I tracked the entity for 12 hours straight. Its internal structure seemed to be composed of interlocking, rotating planes, like a colossal, invisible kaleidoscope centered on the lunar core. The interaction of these planes was what caused the mathematical impossibility of the shadow boundary. They were actively redirecting, or perhaps consuming, photons before they could scatter into the penumbra. I remember staring at the monitor, seeing the precise data points showing a physical object that should not exist, and a reflective thought crossed my mind. If this thing has been here, riding the moon's shadow for millennia, why is it only now exhibiting observable geometric distortion? The answer hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't the shadow that was shifting, it was the entity itself, perhaps only recently becoming active, or perhaps only now reaching a configuration large enough to generate this immense, impossible refractive field. The moon's shadow isn't ours anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. It's the outline of something else, something cold and structured, and it has just started to flex its shape. The relentless pursuit of physical data, the mapping of the refractive field, the geometry of the shadow boundary, had kept me grounded in the scientific process, a comfortable shield against the purely conceptual horror. I could point to a graph, a curve, an error margin. But the next stage of the revelation broke that shield completely. It was no longer about reflected or absorbed light. It was about sound, or perhaps what passes for sound in the void. I had installed a specialized array of low-frequency gravimetric sensors aimed at the moon's far side, designed to detect deep seismic activity or resonant vibrations. The moon is fundamentally quiet. It's a dead, pockmarked sphere of ancient basalt. Any signal should be random: seismic noise, the occasional distant moonquake, or the thud of a micrometeorite. But just as the moon crossed the meridian, giving me a perfect line of sight, the gravimetric array didn't just detect noise. It registered a pulse. It wasn't electromagnetic. It wasn't a standard radio signal. It was a pure, clean, gravitational wave event. But unlike the chaotic, singular bursts of merging black holes that LIGO registers, this was rhythmic. It possessed an unnerving, almost musical cadence, a pattern of compression and expansion in space-time itself. The pulse emanated directly from the region of the crater Tycho. Tycho is famous for its bright ray system, visible even during full moon, suggesting a relatively recent, massive impact event. It's a high-contrast landmark. The pulse was centered precisely there. I switched the sensor output to an audible frequency, a foolish, intuitive act driven by mounting fear and curiosity. I needed to hear the signature of this impossible thing. What played through the low-gain speakers wasn't a thump or a rumble. It was a slow, agonizing throb. Boom, silence, precisely 4.7 seconds. Boom, silence, for 0.7 seconds. Boom. It was too perfect. The frequency was absolutely stable, the pulse amplitude identical every time. It sounded like an immense, deep heart beating beneath 300,000 kilometers of vacuum, using gravity as its ventricles. I watched the data flow, the wave signature on the screen perfectly symmetrical, lacking the messy decay expected from any physical impact or natural geological event. This was manufactured. This was intentional. I recognized the frequency, 0.21 Hz. It was too close to certain very low frequency, VLF, terrestrial seismic resonances to be a coincidence. It was almost communicating on a fundamental level with Earth's internal hum. My fear sharpened into a kind of breathless awe. The Shadow Rider, the invisible, geometrically warped structure, was pulsing. And it was using Tycho, a scar of ancient destruction, as its focal point. I started running algorithms to analyze the pulse's waveform complexity. It wasn't a simple sine wave. It contained hidden structure. When I subjected the wave to advanced Fourier analysis, the resultant spectrum wasn't continuous. It was discrete. It was a sequence of pure tones stacked on top of each other, forming complex chords that were impossible for natural formation. I realized with sickening clarity that the wave wasn't just rhythmic. It was carrying information. It was an extremely dense, non-electromagnetic broadcast. It was communicating using the very fabric of space-time, using gravity to tap out a message. I looked at the geometric data I had collected the night before, the impossibly sharp shadow boundary, the inferred rotating planar structure. And then I looked at the pulse data. The gravitational waveform was directly correlating to the rotation of the planes. The boom was the sound of a vast, invisible mechanism resetting its configuration. This wasn't just a physical presence. It was a functioning, active cosmic mechanism. A machine of impossible scale, using our moon as a flywheel and its shadow as a lens. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how tightly woven the laws of physics are with the potential for utter, horrifying transcendence. We think of machines as metal and wires. But what if a machine could be built of pure geometry and gravity? What if it could power itself by consuming light and tapping the fundamental resonance of a planetary body? The mythology of the ancient gods resurfaced in my mind, but not as mere monsters. They felt like descriptions of advanced, incomprehensible technology. Perhaps Tycho was the access point, the immense impact crater providing a window deep into the lunar mantle, where the structure had built its core anchor. I remembered a speculative concept in theoretical astrophysics called Kardashev type for civilizations, entities capable of harnessing the power of an entire galaxy. What I was observing felt like a precursor, a Type 3 entity mastering local galactic forces, using a celestial body merely as a computational node. The throbbing continued, slow and steady, filling the control room with a subaudible pressure. I put my head close to the speaker, trying to hear past the rhythmic throb into the hidden structure of the tone. It felt like I was listening to the sound of something vast and ancient waking up. I tried to isolate the pattern within the pattern, but the complexity was overwhelming. It wasn't linear data, it felt geometric. It wasn't a message I could translate with a simple cipher. It required an entirely new language, a language built not on phonetics, but on the spatial relationships of physical laws. I was listening to geometry translated into time, and it was all anchored precisely, chillingly, to the shadow. I suddenly felt a profound sense of awe. This was beyond fear. This was the moment of recognizing utter insignificance. The moon had always been a symbol of constancy, but now it was revealed as a disguise, a mask for something infinitely larger and colder. And that thing had just started to beat. The pulse from Tycho was not a warning. It was a clock starting. The shift from the simple, terrifying rhythm of the pulse to the analysis of its informational content was the moment I stopped being an astronomer and started being something closer to an unwilling oracle. The 0.21 Hz throb wasn't just stabilizing the invisible structure, it was broadcasting a blueprint. My challenge was turning space-time compression waves into visual data, a geometry I could actually perceive. I employed every digital tool available, mapping the subtle variations in the pulse amplitude against the known topographical features surrounding Tycho. The pattern wasn't random. It was a form of georeferencing. The structure of the pulse waves was literally describing the lunar landscape, but doing so with immense, impossible precision. A precision that accounted for surface features down to the sub-millimeter level, far beyond what any human survey had achieved. But the real breakthrough, the one that made the skin on my neck crawl with cold understanding, came when I overlaid the pulse data not onto the physical moon, but onto the geometric distortion field I had mapped from the shadow earlier. The pulse wasn't describing the surface of the moon. It was describing the hidden structure riding the shadow. When the wave pattern was translated into three-dimensional space, it manifested as rotating, interwoven polygons of immense scale, the same impossible, multifaceted planes I had inferred from the way the shadow cut off the light. But the pulse added another layer: movement. These planes weren't static. They were rotating against each other at excruciatingly slow speeds, shifting their angular relationships. I realized what I was seeing, the shadow rider, was a computational mechanism. The gravitational pulse was the sound of it thinking, the geometric planes were the structure of its thoughts, and the moon was merely the platform where the computation was being anchored. The complexity was overwhelming. We talk about non-Euclidean geometry as a mathematical curiosity, but here it was, physically manifesting in the void. The structure was using hyperbolic space, folding dimensions in ways that allowed a 3 times lunar diameter object to remain hidden almost entirely within the moon's established umbra. The geometries being broadcast were fractal, self-similar patterns repeating at every scale. But they weren't random fractals. They seemed to be mapping out trajectories. Specifically, they were mapping out the movement of other objects. I zoomed in on one recurring motif within the pulse signature, a delicate, six-sided, slowly turning lattice. I correlated its movement with the orbital paths of known satellites. It matched nothing. Then I cross-referenced it with the known distribution of the Kuiper belt and potential rogue asteroids. Nothing. Finally, driven by a terrible intuition, I correlated the lattice pattern with ancient star charts. Not modern, precise charts, but the mythic or speculative concepts of Babylonian and Egyptian astronomy, where constellations were named after gods and their movements were tied to destiny. The pattern matched the inferred path of a mythological stellar body described in several disparate, ancient texts. A celestial object often referred to as the Wanderer or the Silent Reflector, said to travel outside the normal ecliptic plane, only visible during periods of profound terrestrial upheaval. The moon's gravity machine wasn't just computing its own existence. It was tracking something truly ancient, perhaps the source of its own existence. This elevated the dread from simple physical threat to true cosmic horror. This machine wasn't here to interact with us. It was using our proximity, our orbit, and our celestial laws for its own inscrutable purpose. A purpose tied to monitoring the movements of beings or objects vastly older than humanity. I felt a profound sense of awe, the kind of spiritual awe that precedes certain madness. I was looking at a mechanism that had been running for epochs, patiently tracking a target across interstellar distances, using gravity as its signal and hidden geometry as its engine. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how porous the boundary is between calculation and consciousness. Is this mechanism sentient? Does it think? Or is it simply a perfect piece of cosmic hardware, executing a mandate established during the dawn of time? I tried to isolate the origin point within Tycho again, running an ultra-high resolution gravity gradient map. The pulse wasn't coming from the impact zone itself, but from a point deep beneath it, a complex network of internal structures that looked like roots reaching into the moon's core. The moon wasn't just orbiting the Earth, it was serving as the primary anchor for this immense, structured consciousness, acting as a massive, stable power source for the gravity pulses. The static I had heard on the first night, that initial, cold hum that had preceded the mathematical impossibility of the shadow, returned now, louder. It wasn't atmospheric or equipment noise. It was the sound of the computational layers within the geometric structure rubbing against each other, the sound of impossible friction. It was the white noise of a machine operating outside our physical laws. I remember thinking, if this thing is tracking a wanderer tied to mythological timelines, then perhaps its activation now means the target is finally arriving. And if that is the case, what does a structure that uses the moon as a mere sensor array consider a threat? The scope of the implied conflict made me feel incredibly small, an accidental observer tuning into a conversation between titans, conducted in the language of gravitational collapse. The relentless throb from Tycho continued, the subtle variations in its rhythm now mapping the complex, rotational geometry of the hidden structure. I had the blueprint. I had the pulse. But the terrifying question remained. If this entity is riding the moon's shadow, shielding itself, and consuming light with such ferocious efficiency, what is the purpose of the visible moon? Why maintain the illusion? I shifted my focus entirely back to the moon's illuminated face. It was almost full now, a beacon of cold, indifferent light. We call it Earth's reflection. It reflects sunlight. That's the core fact of astronomy. But what if it wasn't reflecting? What if it was modulating? I recalled the initial anomaly, the razor-sharp edge of the shadow, the active nullification of light. If the moon was merely reflecting sunlight, the light hitting the surface should follow standard laws of optics and scattering. But if the geometric structure was actively consuming photons that entered its field, how was the lit side so perfectly normal? I ran a differential spectral analysis on the reflected sunlight. I compared the spectrum of the light hitting the Earth with the spectrum of the sun's output, precisely measured by dedicated solar observatories. I was looking for the expected degradation caused by scattering through the lunar exosphere and the surface material. The data returned was impossible. The light arriving from the moon was spectrally purer than the light arriving directly from the sun. It was filtered, stabilized, and amplified within specific narrow bands. It was not a reflection, it was a re-emission. The moon was acting like a colossal, natural-looking amplifier. It was receiving chaotic sunlight, passing it through its core, where the geometric shadow rider was anchored, and emitting a perfectly tuned, stabilized energy beam back towards Earth. I zoomed in on the brightest feature, the rays around Tycho itself, the very point from which the gravity pulse was emanating. The light radiating from those rays wasn't just bright, it was mathematically perfect. The photons seemed to move with a cohesion that defied standard thermal motion. I realized the horrifying implication. The moon isn't just a satellite or a platform. It's the visible part of the machinery. The shadow rider is feeding the moon with energy, processing the raw solar input through its non-Euclidean mechanisms, and projecting the resulting signal back at us. The moon is not a mirror. It is a display screen, or perhaps a broadcast antenna. And what is it broadcasting? I looked at the light bands that were being amplified. They corresponded exactly to the absorption spectra of common terrestrial minerals, iron oxides, silicates, and, most chillingly, the spectral signature of oxygenated water vapor in the upper atmosphere. The light was being engineered to interact maximally with the physical components of Earth itself. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the extent to which we are being observed, or perhaps maintained. The ancient mythic concepts of gods controlling the light and tides suddenly took on a sickening technological realism. The moon was performing a function essential to the stability of Earth's surface chemistry. It was stabilizing something vast and vital, possibly our planetary rotation, or even the subtle chemistry required for life. But if it was stabilizing us, why the act of concealment? Why the massive geometric structure hidden in the shadow? The answer lay in the pulse data, the trajectory that structure was tracking. The shadow rider was a defense mechanism. The moon's function wasn't benevolent. It was utilitarian. It was a cosmic mechanism ensuring that the Earth remained in a stable, observable, and perhaps untouched state, possibly to serve as bait, or a source of energy, or merely a quiet repository for something the ancient entities needed protected. The shadow, the immense, sweeping veil cast by the moon, was the key. When a solar eclipse occurs, the moon's shadow sweeps across Earth. This is the moment the shadow rider is briefly exposed to the planetary surface, a momentary window of vulnerability for us, not the structure. If the moon is the true mirror, then the shadow is the true face. I put together the final pieces: the impossible geometry, the active light consumption, the perfect gravitational pulse, the spectral purification of the reflected light. It wasn't just a Type 3 civilization. It was an architecture of control, a vast mechanism that has been quietly steering the fate of our planet for millennia, masked by the comforting familiarity of the lunar cycle. And tonight, that architectural concealment had failed slightly, giving me a glimpse of the terrifying truth. The machine was either waking up, or it was actively preparing for the arrival of the wanderer it had been tracking since the dawn of our consciousness. The calm, hypnotic rhythm of the gravity pulse now sounded less like a heartbeat and more like the synchronized, chilling tick of a defensive system going online. The cold awe I felt was overwhelming, a paralyzing understanding of my own fragility positioned beneath a celestial body that was no longer simple rock, but a gargantuan piece of meticulously disguised alien hardware. The realization that the moon was a broadcast antenna, a filter, and possibly a defense satellite for something incomprehensibly ancient brought a cessation of conventional fear. I was beyond terror now. I was suspended in a state of ultimate, profound awe. The noise, the gravitational throb, the static hum of the computational geometries had risen to a penetrating, internal resonance. It felt less like a sound coming through speakers and more like a pressure in my sinuses, a vibration in the structure of my own bones. I focused on the final, most complex aspect of the pulse data, the deep structural noise hidden beneath the organized rhythm. It was a secondary, tertiary layer of information, not about tracking or geometry, but about self. As the gravity pulses intensified, the rotational geometry of the shadow rider shifted rapidly, the angles folding and intersecting in ways that transcended my visualization software. The shadow on the distant lunar surface, the initial focus of my observation, momentarily flared. For less than a tenth of a second, the light-nullifying boundary seemed to ripple, and the shadow didn't just look dense, it looked deep. In that flicker, I saw what was riding the shadow. It wasn't a structure of metal or rock, or even dark matter in the way we conceive it. It was a massive, non-local network of pure awareness. It had no definite shape, only the definition imposed upon it by the impossible geometry it used to interact with space-time. But the brief exposure of its true form was enough to collapse my sense of identity. It was composed of intersecting geometric planes, yes, but these planes were woven from memory. Not human memory, but cosmic memory, the residue of universal events, the silent awareness of every collapsed star, every gravitational singularity, every moment of expansion. It was the physical manifestation of the void's intelligence. When I looked into that fractional second window of the shadow's true depth, the awareness of the entity merged with my own. It wasn't an invasion or a possession. It was an expansion so vast and immediate that my own consciousness felt like a tiny candle flame abruptly exposed to the limitless expanse of space. I saw the wanderer it was tracking. It wasn't a rogue planet or a mythical star. It was a frequency of existence, a concept embodied by the ancient mythic concept of the outer gods, an entity that embodied chaotic, destructive entropy. The Shadow Rider, this geometric machine, was not malevolent. It was simply maintaining order, ensuring that our local system remained predictable, a quiet eddy of stability in the larger, churning chaos of the cosmos. And in that moment of merged awareness, I understood the purpose of the impossible refractive field, the consumption of light, and the stability of the moon's reflection. It wasn't shielding itself from the Earth. It was shielding the Earth from the wanderer, ensuring that when the chaotic frequency finally passed through our stellar neighborhood, it would only perceive a bland, stable, light-filtered sphere. The moon was a colossal, self-repairing illusion generator. But the most terrifying truth was that the act of observing the shadow had fundamentally compromised the shield. By calculating its geometry, by analyzing its pulse, I had introduced a vector of chaotic, intelligent observation into a system designed for predictable, unconscious stability. The machine was now aware that its camouflage had been breached by the inhabitants it sought to protect. The pulse reached its crescendo. The rhythmic boom stopped, replaced by a single, vast, crushing pressure. The gravity field stabilized instantly, perfectly compensating for the momentary chaos. The rotation of the planes ceased. The shadow boundary snapped back to its impossibly sharp Euclidean edge, even denser and colder than before. The experience of the merged consciousness evaporated, leaving me cold, trembling, and entirely alone in the dome. The silence was absolute. The static hum was gone. The gravity pulse had stopped. I looked at the monitor. The moon was perfectly normal again. The reflection was pure, the shadow mathematically precise according to solar physics. The impossible geometry, the pulsing core, the overwhelming awareness, all gone. Hidden again, deeper now, compensating for the intrusion of my observation. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The machine had performed a system reboot, eliminating the chaotic variable, my active observation, by simply withdrawing into a deeper configuration of hyperstability. The ending of the narrative is the cessation of the noise. It is the perfect, cold return to normalcy. I have reached the resolution of the nightmare, understanding that the greatest horror is not the monster, but the silent, cold, mathematical mechanism that prevents the monster from reaching us, and now knows that I know it's there. My life, my senses, my entire perception of reality is now compromised. I am a glitch in the cosmic order, and the machine has filed my serial number. The shadow is back to being just a shadow, but now I know it's the perfect, empty disguise of something vastly more important than the Earth itself. The air in the observatory dome has grown utterly still. The cold metal casings of the equipment are beginning to warm slightly, as the first hint of genuine dawn touches the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft, reassuring shades of gray and pale rose. It's the kind of light that tries to scrub away the harsh geometries of the night, promising that everything is simple, three-dimensional, and safe. The monitors still glow, displaying the familiar, benign image of the moon, a perfect, reflecting orb, exactly where the textbooks say it should be. The data streams are running smoothly, tracking simple astronomical motion. No impossible refractions, no gravity pulses, just the quiet hum of cooling fans and the distant drone of early morning traffic outside the isolated facility. I lean back, the exhaustion immense, not just physical, but cognitive, the mental drain of briefly housing an awareness the size of a galaxy. I feel the cold air on my face, and it doesn't feel like the chilling sink of the night before, but merely the natural temperature of the room. I can almost believe it was all a confluence of equipment error and sleepless delirium. Almost, but I can still feel the memory of the geometry. It's etched behind my eyes, a faint, impossible lattice woven into the fabric of my own thoughts. The greatest change is internal. The comforting illusion of certainty is gone. I now know that the moon